They say some houses are haunted, but what if one was a gateway, a passage not to the afterlife, but to something older, deeper, something that remembers us? Welcome to the forgotten legacy of the Addington family. A case so disturbing it was redacted from public record, buried under layers of denial, and hidden behind the facade of Gothic opulence. This isn't just a haunted house story, this is historical horror at its most insidious, where forbidden rituals, dimensional gateways, and ancient bloodlines converge. For nearly 2 centuries, Addington Manor stood in the misty highlands of England like a cancer on the landscape, its walls soaked with generational trauma, unsolved disappearances, and a curse that mutated with time. You won't find this in textbooks or documentaries, but survivors, fragmented journals, and declassified government documents paint a terrifying pattern. A family line hollowed out, one by one, in service of something that should not exist. If you've ever dreamed of a house you've never visited, this story may already belong to you. In the winter of 1842, Alaric Addington, a ruthless industrialist with ambitions far beyond coal and steel, purchased an abandoned estate nestled deep in the northern moors of England. The manor, once belonging to the disgraced Ashcroft lineage, was acquired at a price so low it raised eyebrows among local officials. But Alaric didn't flinch. To him, whispers of accursed property meant opportunity, land no one else dared claim. What he didn't understand, or refused to acknowledge, was that this place wasn't simply neglected. It had been deliberately avoided. Locals spoke of vanished surveyors, of strange magnetic shifts near the property line, and of stone formations older than recorded history. But Alaric saw only foundations, resources, and control. He didn't know that what he'd just inherited was not just a manor, but a machine built to contain something ancient and watching. And as we'll soon uncover, the first cracks in that containment appeared long before the walls were ever raised. Some stories aren't lost, they're erased on purpose. In 1842, a manor appeared on no maps, was spoken of in no records, and yet stood tall among the mist-shrouded hills of northern England like it had always been there. This was Addington Manor, or as it was once known before the name was changed, Ashcroft House, a place with no history and too much silence. It wasn't just abandoned, it had been strategically forgotten, its name stripped from ledgers, its ownership obscured by shell companies and missing deeds. Why? Because those who once entered never returned the same. Government files declassified decades later contain partial reports, mostly blacked out, mentioning dimensional instability, auditory hallucinations, and ritual architecture embedded in foundation stones. But the public never saw these. The last known survivor of a research team from 1923 said only this before vanishing: "You can bury a house, but you can't bury what remembers it." Since then, hundreds of references to the Addington family legacy have mysteriously vanished from census archives, church registries, even genealogical databases. What kind of power could erase bloodlines? What kind of truth demands to stay hidden? In this first chapter, we pull back the veil and step into the shadows where the Addington curse began. Not all absences are accidental. Some are engineered. In the case of Addington Manor, the silence surrounding its origins isn't just eerie, it's deliberate. When researchers attempted to trace the land's history, they discovered a blackout zone in official records, a strange anomaly where tax maps, birth certificates, and burial permits all end at the same point. 1842. It's as if everything before that year had been surgically removed from British historical memory. What little remains are whispers, fragments, a missing cartographer, a clergyman who fell ill after surveying the grounds, an archivist found raving about a door that breathes. Local folklore speaks of burial mounds that hum at night, of stone circles shifting ever so slightly with the seasons, and of livestock who refuse to graze near the northern edge of the property. Modern geological surveys reveal electromagnetic anomalies so precise they form symmetrical patterns in the soil, like the earth itself was altered to hold something in or keep something out. And then there's the name, Addington. It appears abruptly, with no recorded lineage before Alaric Addington's arrival. A man with no known ancestors, who amassed his fortune from mines no one dared dig. We'll return to him soon, but first, let's examine the land he chose to build on, and why it may have chosen him first. They say land holds memory, but some land holds something worse. Before Addington Manor rose from the fog, the property was little more than twisted moorland and gnarled ash trees scorched at their roots. Locals avoided the area long before the Addington name ever surfaced. Shepherds refused to guide their flocks through it. Children spoke of figures watching from the mist, always just far enough away to question if they were real. The oldest grave marker within 10 miles belongs to a girl named Bryony Hale, age 11, who reportedly walked into the hills and never came back until she did. Her body was found weeks later, barefoot, eyes open, mouth full of black soil. The official reports claimed exposure. The town priest claimed something else. Whatever took her, sent her back unfinished. And perhaps most disturbing is this. When Alaric Addington began construction, his workers reported unearthed stonework beneath the topsoil, shaped not like a foundation, but like a spiral, descending downward, impossible to chart. They tried to demolish it. The spiral reappeared the next day, not rebuilt, restored, as if it never left. This wasn't just land waiting for a house. It was a gate waiting for a key. And Alaric had just brought one. He didn't just build a house. He completed a pattern. When Alaric Addington broke ground in the spring of 1843, he wasn't designing a home. He was finishing something ancient. The blueprints were unlike anything local architects had ever seen. Asymmetrical corridors, windows that aligned only at certain solstices, rooms sealed before construction even ended. Workers whispered about tools vanishing, hearing footsteps in unfinished halls, and a persistent sound behind the walls, a rhythmic pulse, like a slow heartbeat. Alaric called it resonance. But what exactly was this structure meant to resonate with? Beneath the elegance of Addington Manor was an architectural code hidden in brick and timber, one that mirrored diagrams found only in esoteric texts and forbidden grimoires. He claimed inspiration from dreams, but his journals suggest otherwise. A voice in the walls that gave him shapes, sequences, and instructions. And as each wing of the house took form, something in the surrounding moors began to change. Animals fled, weather patterns fractured, and those closest to Alaric began to unravel. In our next section, we meet the ones who lived inside Addington Manor, and the chilling truth of how it reshaped them. The house didn't feel finished, because it wasn't meant to be. From the moment Alaric moved into Addington Manor, strange inconsistencies plagued the structure. Rooms seemed to shift size overnight. Doors that once opened to hallways now led to brick. Entire windows vanished and reappeared depending on the time of day. The servants were the first to speak out, complaining of mirrored reflections that moved half a second too slow, and clocks that ticked backward between midnight and 3. One maid reported waking up to find all the furniture in her room perfectly reversed, mirror imaged, as if she had been moved into a copy of her own space without ever leaving the bed. Alaric dismissed these reports as stress. But privately, he began journaling what he called dimensional soft spots, points in the house where gravity felt off, voices echoed wrong, or time bent slightly inward. One entry reads, "The eastern wing breathes at dawn, not metaphorically. I placed a candle in the hall. It flickers in and out as if something inhales." That same wing would later be sealed entirely, bricked shut without explanation. But even after sealing it, staff claimed they still heard footsteps pacing just beyond the wall. The house had accepted its first tenants, and it had already begun rewriting them. It started with a mirror, but it ended with a message. Charles Addington, Alaric's only son, was 13 when he began speaking to his reflection. Not in the way children pretend, but in full conversations, paused, listening, responding as if someone else were on the other side. At first, the family dismissed it as harmless imagination, a symptom of isolation inside a sprawling, empty manor. But then Charles began drawing things, symbols that didn't match any known language, spiral patterns that mirrored the original foundation discovered under the soil. He claimed they were teaching him, though he never named who they were. One night, the housekeeper found him standing perfectly still in the east corridor, facing a mirror that had never been installed there before. He whispered, "It's not showing me. It's showing what's behind me." When she blinked, the mirror was gone. Weeks later, Charles's journals shifted tone. He wrote that the house wasn't haunted. It was listening, and that its purpose wasn't to trap spirits, but to filter people. Only the ones who heard the tone would remain. The rest would fade. When questioned, he simply smiled and said, "I'm almost through." Through what? No one ever got a clear answer. But from that point on, Charles no longer cast a shadow. The manor began speaking, not in words, but in patterns. Around the 3rd month of living inside Addington Manor, Alaric's guests started reporting a shared experience, recurring dreams of spirals, water running upward, and a voice humming in a language they couldn't repeat once awake. These dreams occurred only inside the house and ended the moment they stepped off the property. The most unnerving case was that of Dr. Elias Granger, a skeptic and close friend of Alaric, who agreed to spend 3 nights in the West Wing to disprove the rumours. On the 2nd night, he carved into his journal, "There are sounds beneath the sounds. The house is layered." He left the next morning with blood trailing from his ears and refused to speak again. But perhaps the most bizarre evidence came from the dining room itself. Guests noticed that plates would subtly shift during meals, not slide, but slightly reorient, as if aligning with an unseen grid beneath the table. At first, they laughed it off, until one evening a spilled wine glass followed the edge of the table in a perfect curve against gravity, looping back to its original spot without tipping. Alaric recorded the event, describing it as a spatial correction event, and noted that it occurred only during the choral hour, a specific 12-minute window just after sunset when the entire manor emitted a low, harmonic vibration. barely audible yet impossible to ignore. From that point forward, no guest remained overnight twice. The house had made its presence known, and it had begun choosing who stayed and who forgot. The house didn't collapse. It transformed. What began as architectural curiosity turned into a full-blown unravelling of reality. By the 6th month, Addington Manor was no longer behaving like a structure. It was behaving like a living system, reacting to emotions, responding to specific names, and even locking or unlocking doors based on unspoken intent. This wasn't a haunting. This was an activation. And what it awakened next would spiral far beyond the Addington family's control. By the 7th month, Addington Manor was no longer just unstable, it was predatory. Servants quit in waves, some without packing, some without speaking. The few who remained described a growing presence in the halls, not seen, but sensed, like walking through breath held too long. Doors now locked from the inside without latches. Windows refused to open, and daylight began to feel artificial, pale and sterile, casting shadows in the wrong direction. Charles stopped eating. He only hummed, a slow, repeating 3-note melody that caused headaches in anyone nearby. Alaric attempted to regain control, bringing in masons, priests, even an occultist from Prague who stayed exactly one night before clawing his way out through a first-floor window, screaming that the geometry is folding in on itself. His hands never stopped shaking. One guest, attempting to flee, was found circling the same hallway for hours, despite surveillance proving he never moved more than 10 feet. The house was fragmenting space. It was learning how to isolate, how to trap, how to test. And the Addingtons? They weren't owners anymore. They were variables in a structure rewriting its own laws, and it had just begun to experiment with time. The clock stopped, but the house kept going. In the 3rd week of November, all mechanical timepieces within Addington Manor froze at 3:16 a.m. Not once. Every night. Exactly. Attempts to reset them failed, and digital replacements short-circuited within hours. Alaric ordered the installation of external clocks mounted outside the walls. But those too began to drift. Time bending inward, compressing, looping. Servants reported experiencing entire conversations twice. Déjà vu episodes that overlapped like flickering film reels. Charles would vanish for hours and return with no memory of where he'd been, yet his shoes were wet and his pockets filled with soil. At one point, he was found in the wine cellar, staring at the brick wall and whispering, "There's another version of me behind this." Alaric, now consumed by the phenomenon, stopped sleeping. His final journal entries are jagged and erratic, written in mirror script, obsessing over threshold mechanics and temporal inflection points. Visitors stopped coming. Letters were returned unopened. The manor no longer accepted outside time. It had sealed its ecosystem, turning its inhabitants into study subjects, samples inside a structure that now pulsed with sentience. And the worst was yet to surface, because the manor was no longer mimicking life. It was becoming something else. The manor stopped obeying physics, and then it stopped obeying memory. Hallways extended for miles at night, only to shrink by morning. Entire rooms vanished from the blueprints, yet were still felt by those who passed near their former locations. Servants would open a door and find themselves staring at their own backs. Not in a mirror, but from a distance, across the same room, caught in a loop they couldn't step out of. Alaric became increasingly unstable, writing that he had seen versions of himself walking the grounds, older, younger, dressed in clothes he didn't own yet. Charles, now gaunt and hollow-eyed, stopped responding to his name. He answered only to the other. One evening, during a thunderstorm, lightning struck the roof, and every mirror in the house cracked simultaneously, forming the same symbol, a spiral intersected by a vertical line. That night, the manor's eastern wing opened again, on its own. The bricked wall fell inward, revealing a staircase that spiraled down into blackness, one that had never been built, never planned, never accounted for, and yet it had always been waiting. Alaric entered first, only one servant followed. Neither came back, but the house began breathing louder. Whatever it was preparing for, it was almost ready. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was an instruction. What lay beneath Addington Manor was not a basement, not a tomb, but a design, a recursive descent that mirrored the collapse of reality itself. With Alaric gone and Charles changed beyond recognition, the final descent would reveal what the manor had always been hiding beneath its impossible angles and vanishing walls. And what they found down there rewrote everything. They didn't find a foundation. They found a replica. Beneath the manor was an exact mirror of the house above, but inverted, an underground double where gravity bent inward. Light moved slower, and sounds echoed before they were made. Every room existed in reverse, but not abandoned, occupied. The furniture was warm, candles burned in glassless lanterns, and portraits on the walls depicted the Addingtons, but not quite. In each frame, the eyes were just slightly too wide, the smiles strained, the angles of their faces subtly wrong. One servant whispered, "They're not paintings. They're watching us watch them." Charles stood in the mirrored dining hall, humming that same three-note tune. But it was no longer a lullaby. It was a command. Behind him, dozens of figures began to emerge from the walls, not ghosts, but copies, rehearsals, failed versions, each one whispering in unison, "Return the original." Reality frayed, time staggered. The group tried to flee but ended up back at the same stairwell. Down was no longer down. It was forever. And the house? It didn't want them dead. It wanted them rewritten. The deeper they went, the less human they remained. As the stairwell spiraled downward, their reflections began acting independently, smiling when they didn't, mimicking gestures before they moved, whispering words they hadn't spoken yet. One servant, Elias, collapsed in terror after seeing his reflection turn and walk away into the mirror wall, leaving him behind. His final words were, "That wasn't me. That was the version that passed." Alaric's voice began to layer, one tone calm, the other guttural, echoing milliseconds apart. His eyes no longer blinked in sync. The hallway walls became fluid, pulsing like lungs, and the stone underfoot grew warm, soft, almost skin-like. A door appeared at the base of the spiral, one that didn't open, but absorbed. Charles pressed his hand against it, and it simply took him. No flash, no sound, just a slow folding, like paper into a pocket. The others screamed, but sound no longer carried. In this place, language dissolved, identity blurred. Addington Manor wasn't haunted, it was consuming. And what it consumed, it rebuilt in its own image, logic fractured, memory no longer guaranteed you existed. Names began to fail first, then faces, then meaning. deep in the spiral, identity became liquid. One servant turned to speak, only to find no mouth on his companion's face, just smooth skin where expression used to be. Another wept silently, clutching a photo of his wife, only to watch the image fade and reform into someone else, someone he didn't know, but felt obligated to love. The walls whispered possibilities, timelines where children were never born, wars never ended, brothers never forgiven. Each room revealed versions of lives unlived, mistakes corrected, or tragedies amplified. Alaric, now barefoot and bleeding from the ears, began to chant phrases that no one had taught him, syllables that made the light around them bend inward. His shadow separated from his body and walked beside him. The group reached a final chamber, where a massive, breathing mirror waited, not a reflection, but a gate. Inside it was a version of Addington Manor, with no one left alive, just doorways opening and closing on their own. Behind them, the spiral began to seal. The house had tested their minds. Now, it would test their choices, and not all of them would remain themselves. The mirror didn't reflect them, it replaced them. When Alaric stepped forward, his image stepped out. Not simultaneously, not symmetrically. It moved first, it smiled first, and it spoke first. The others stood frozen as this doppelganger, dressed identically but blinking out of rhythm, greeted them with a voice too smooth, like a perfect impersonation running on corrupted code. He failed his loop, it whispered. Will you do better? Behind the glass, hundreds of other figures began pressing forward, each one a variation of someone from above. Dead relatives, former maids, children they had never met but somehow remembered holding. Each carried fragments of truth and lies, blending memory with fabrication. The servant Miriam screamed as she recognized herself in 4 versions, one pregnant, one burnt, one faceless, one still alive. The room pulsed. The laws of cause and effect snapped like wet thread. Time became non-linear. The doppelganger Alaric turned back toward the mirror and whispered a phrase in a language no one recognized, and half the room vanished. Not in smoke, but in certainty. They had never been there at all. This wasn't just a haunting, it was an overwrite. And Addington was almost done sinking. The manor no longer needed them to believe. It simply needed them to accept. As the last figure stepped forward, Alaric's voice broke through the distorted reality of the room, each word trembling like a whisper caught in a thunderstorm. You were never meant to leave, he said, his eyes wide with a cold, unnatural knowledge. The ground beneath them began to split, revealing a chasm of endless shifting shapes. The walls bled sound, screams, laughs, whispers, shifting between timelines, moments, and lives that were never meant to exist. Charles, his face twitching in recognition, finally asked, "What are you?" The mirror answered for him, its voice no longer his own. "We are the house," it replied, the echo of his father's voice dissolving into the void. "We were always here, waiting. The truth isn't in time, it's in you. And now you know. You never left. You've always been a part of us." The room tilted, and with it, everything they had ever known, memory, space, even themselves, collapsed inward like a dying star. The manor was no longer a house. It was a trap, and it had claimed them all. The house didn't just consume them, it rebuilt them. When the manor's final collapse came, It wasn't with a scream or explosion, but a subtle shift. Time twisted like a distorted reel, and each person who had ever lived within its walls was woven back into the fabric of the house. The truth was undeniable. Addington Manor was no longer a place. It was a reality unto itself. No one could leave, because they were never truly there. Alaric's journal entries stopped abruptly, leaving behind only a series of symbols no one could decipher. And yet, somehow, those symbols began to appear on objects around the manor. Chairs, mirrors, even the soil itself. The house had become a living pattern, an endless loop that stretched far beyond the walls. In the next chapter, we explore how the manor continued to influence the world outside its borders, and how its reach still grows, even today. The aftermath of Addington Manor didn't end with its collapse. It bled into the world outside. Over the next few years, locals spoke of flickering streetlights that cast shadows of people who weren't there, of mirrors reflecting figures that never entered rooms, of whispers heard on windless nights. DNA traces from the area began showing up in families far beyond the manor's property, linking individuals who never knew the Addington name. The house didn't just leave its mark on the land, it rewrote it. And in 2017, the truth surfaced. A bloodline connected to Addington Manor now existed in over 60% of children born in the nearby towns. Genetic anomalies, unexplained phenomena, whispers of the house's return surfaced across social media. People began to dream of it, the manor rising once more, its windows glowing, its doors waiting. Those who dared enter spoke of a persistent feeling. They weren't visiting, it was waiting for them. The cycle was beginning again. And this time, it wasn't just the house that would reshape them. It was their very existence. The influence of Addington Manor never faded. It simply grew stronger, lurking in the corners of the real world. In the years following its collapse, a strange pattern began to emerge in nearby towns. People who had no connection to the manor started experiencing the same unsettling phenomena. Mysterious symbols appearing on walls, faint whispers from empty rooms, and most disturbingly, vivid dreams of the manor itself, its halls, its doors, its shifting rooms. Doctors who studied these cases spoke of a collective psychological contagion, but the truth was far darker. It wasn't just a mental effect, it was a physical imprint left on the world itself. In 2023, a team of researchers led by Dr. Helena Ford began investigating the abnormal increase in these disturbances. What they discovered shook them to their core. The manor's structure had been rebuilt, not in stone, but in the minds of those who were drawn to it. The house had shifted reality itself, infiltrating the dreams, memories, and even the very DNA of anyone near its reach. As more people came forward, claiming the same visions and feelings, it became clear. Addington Manor was no longer confined to its decaying walls. It had become a part of them. The consequences of Addington Manor didn't just ripple, they consumed everything they touched. In 2025, a series of unexplainable geological shifts occurred near the site, disturbing the earth beneath and around the former estate. Satellite imagery showed erratic electromagnetic pulses emanating from the area, and soon, inexplicable occurrences followed, localized time distortions, equipment failures, and sudden disappearances. But the most terrifying effect was on the people. Those with ancestral ties to the Addington bloodline began exhibiting strange behaviours, visions, blackouts, and, in extreme cases, dissociative episodes where they claimed to relive moments from the manor's past. A town historian, once sceptical, now spoke in fragments of memory as if recalling events that hadn't yet occurred. The house wasn't just haunting them, it was rewriting their realities. The most disturbing part? The more they tried to escape, the more they were pulled back into its orbit. It was as though Addington Manor had imprinted itself on time, and the universe was recalibrating to fit it back in. The worst part wasn't the memories. It was the feeling that something was waiting. By 2030, the entire area around Addington Manor was declared a restricted zone, surrounded by high fences and guarded by military personnel. Yet inexplicably, reports continued to surface of people mysteriously wandering into the grounds. Most alarmingly, some who ventured near the manor began to speak of hearing voices, soft at first, then growing clearer, repeating the same chilling phrase, "Come home." Children born in nearby towns grew up with nightmares of the manor, despite never having seen it, describing rooms they could never have known, and mimicking the same actions as those who vanished in the manor's past. Their eyes, too, began to change. People felt watched, felt drawn to it, even as the world around them warned them away. The manor had infected time, infected memory, and now it seemed to be infecting the next generation. What was left of its influence? Was it a curse, a doorway, or something worse entirely? And perhaps most terrifying of all, was there anyone left who truly escaped? The truth of Addington Manor didn't just linger, it poisoned everything it touched. In the years that followed, those who studied the area found unexplained shifts in the electromagnetic field, strange patterns in local wildlife, and an unsettling increase in spontaneous disappearances. Locals whispered of shadows watching from windows that shouldn't have been there, of people who would wander into the woods and never return, leaving behind only the faintest trace of footsteps, as if they were never meant to be. Time itself felt warped, with many recalling the same date, December 21st, repeated over and over. The manor, now nothing more than a ghostly memory in the town's past, continued to resonate with a disturbing call. Children born in the nearby villages began dreaming of the manor, describing the layout of rooms and corridors they had never seen. Their drawings filled with cryptic symbols that matched nothing in history. But it wasn't just the land. It was the very people who came into contact with it. Their bloodline forever tied to something that didn't belong in this world. Something waiting to return. And now, as the years continue to pass, the question remains: what will happen when the last of them is gone? Will the manor finally be forgotten? Or will it rise again? Addington Manor was never just a house. It was a reflection of our deepest fears and desires. A place where the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. Its influence lingers in every shadow, every whisper, and in every story passed down through generations. But here's the chilling truth. We are all connected to it now, whether we want to be or not. The manor's curse didn't die. It's waiting, still watching, still pulling at the edges of our consciousness. Do you hear its call? Or perhaps you felt it in the quiet moments when you're alone. If you've made it this far, it means the manor has already left its mark on you. So, tell us, what do you think? Could the curse still be alive? Are we all just one step away from being drawn into its web? Let us know in the comments. Hit that like button if you felt the chill down your spine. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss the next dark chapter of history we uncover. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed.